January 17, 1946, Sugamo Prison, Tokyo. The winter sun hung pale and cold over the sprawling complex of Sugamo Prison, its concrete walls stained with the residue of war and ash still settling over a defeated empire. Inside the administrative block, 3 Japanese women sat rigid on wooden benches, their hands folded in their laps with a precision born from years of military discipline. Lieutenant Yamada Fumiko, 32 years old, former administrative officer of the Imperial Japanese Army's Communications Division, stared at the scuffed floor beneath her boots. Beside her sat Captain Sato Michiko and Lieutenant Tanaka Reiko, both former officers in the Women's Auxiliary Services. The air tasted of disinfectant and uncertainty. Through the barred windows came the sound of American voices, casual and loud, speaking a language that still felt like the enemy's tongue. They waited. In the old world, the world that had ended just 5 months earlier with the Emperor's unprecedented radio address, they would have known their fate. In that world, capture meant dishonor. Capture meant a shame worse than death itself. Every Japanese soldier, every citizen who served the empire understood this fundamental truth with the clarity of religious doctrine. The military code was absolute. Surrender was betrayal, capture was corruption of the spirit, and women taken by enemy forces faced a destiny too terrible to name aloud. It was better to die. It was better to take one's own life. The propaganda films had shown them what happened to women in enemy hands. The Russians in Manchuria. The stories whispered about Chinese villages, the fate considered inevitable and universal. Yet here they sat, alive, waiting. The door opened. An American military police sergeant entered, clipboard in hand, his uniform crisp despite the long months of occupation duty. Behind him came 2 more soldiers, young men with open faces that showed no particular cruelty, no hunger, no violence, just tired professionalism. The sergeant looked at his list, mangled the pronunciation of their names, and gestured for them to stand. Lieutenant Yamada's breath caught in her chest. This was the moment. This was when the mask would fall away, and the enemy would reveal his true nature. "You'll be moved to the women's facility," the sergeant said through a Japanese interpreter, a Nisei soldier whose face held both cultures in uncomfortable balance. "You'll have separate quarters. Medical examination tomorrow morning. Any questions?" The 3 women remained silent. Questions implied dialogue. Dialogue implied humanity on both sides. They had been taught better than that what Lieutenant Yamada Fumiko could not have known, what no Japanese officer in that cold January could have understood, was that she was about to witness something that would shatter every certainty she had been taught to hold sacred. The American treatment of female prisoners of war was not an act of kindness. It was not mercy. It was something far more dangerous to the ideology she had served. It was policy. It was systematic. It was the mundane application of principles that her entire military education had taught her were lies the enemy told to mask their barbarism. She was about to learn that the greatest weapon America possessed was not the atomic bomb, not the B-29 superfortress, not the industrial capacity that had drowned the Pacific in steel and fire. The greatest weapon was something she had no framework to comprehend: the stubborn, unremarkable, bureaucratic insistence that even enemies were human beings with rights that could not be stripped away, even in defeat. But understanding this would take time, and the learning would be painful in ways no military training had prepared her for. To comprehend the depth of confusion that Japanese women officers experienced in American captivity, one must first understand the ideology that shaped their worldview from childhood. The Japanese military education system of the 1930s and early 1940s did not simply teach tactics and logistics. It reconstructed reality itself, creating a complete philosophical framework in which the individual existed only as an extension of the emperor's will, and the nation's destiny was both sacred and inevitable. For women who served in the Imperial Japanese military, this indoctrination carried an additional burden. They were taught that their primary value lay in their purity and their utility to the empire. The Women's Auxiliary Corps, established in 1942 as Japan's manpower reserves dwindled, recruited educated women from good families, teachers, nurses, office workers, and transformed them into functionaries of the war machine. They managed communications, maintained records, operated telephone exchanges, and freed men for combat roles. But they were also taught, with relentless consistency, that capture by the enemy meant something worse than death. The educational materials were explicit. Training manuals for women's auxiliary units contained entire sections on maintaining honor in the face of potential capture. The instruction was clear. Use the hand grenades provided. Use the knife. Use anything. But do not allow yourself to be taken alive. American and British soldiers, they were told, were animals driven by base instincts, incapable of the restraint that Japanese discipline provided. Russian soldiers were worse. Chinese soldiers worst of all. The evidence presented was selective, distorted, often fabricated, but it was presented with the authority of the state and the sanction of military command. This was not paranoia. This was curriculum. By 1945, this ideology had been refined through years of warfare into something approaching religious conviction. When the garrisons on Saipan fell in July 1944, Japanese civilians and military personnel alike chose mass suicide rather than face capture. Mothers threw their children from cliffs before jumping themselves. Soldiers detonated grenades in caves where families had gathered. The Americans who witnessed this were horrified, unable to comprehend the depth of fear and indoctrination that would drive parents to kill their own children. But from the Japanese perspective, this was love. This was protection. This was saving their families from a fate worse than death. When Lieutenant Yamada and her fellow officers were captured in the chaotic final days of the war, they had expected to die. When they did not die immediately, they expected that death would come slowly, after defilement and torture. When neither defilement nor torture materialized in the first days, they assumed it was simply delayed, a cat playing with mice before the kill. The confusion they experienced was not relief. It was cognitive dissonance so profound it bordered on psychological trauma. Every day that passed without the expected horrors was not a gift, but a mystery that threatened the foundations of everything they understood about the world. The American military, meanwhile, operated under a completely different set of assumptions, enshrined in documents that most American soldiers had never read, but whose principles they had absorbed through training and culture. The Geneva Conventions of 1929, the U.S. Army's rules of land warfare, and a broader cultural belief, imperfect and often violated in practice, but genuine in aspiration, that there were rules even in war, and that violating those rules diminished the violator more than the victim. The U.S. military's treatment of prisoners of war was codified in Army Regulation 6-15-100, which drew directly from the Geneva Conventions. It specified that prisoners were to be treated humanely, protected from violence and intimidation, given adequate food and shelter, and allowed to maintain contact with their families through the International Red Cross. Female prisoners were entitled to additional protections. They were to be housed separately from male prisoners, supervised by female personnel whenever possible, and protected explicitly from any form of sexual violence or harassment. Violations of these regulations were punishable under military law, including by court-martial. This was not secret. This was not propaganda. This was standard operating procedure. But for Lieutenant Yamada and thousands like her, this procedural mundanity was incomprehensible. They had been taught that such regulations were merely words, masks that would be discarded the moment they were no longer useful for propaganda purposes. They waited for the mask to fall. They prepared themselves mentally for the moment when the performance would end. The mask never fell. The performance, they slowly realized, was not a performance. The women's section of Sugamo Prison occupied a converted administrative building on the eastern edge of the complex, separated from the male prisoners by 200 yards and a 12-foot fence. By February 1946, it housed 47 Japanese women, most of them former military personnel or civilian employees of military administration. The conditions were Spartan but adequate. Each woman had a narrow bed with 2 blankets, a small footlocker for personal items, and access to communal washing facilities that provided hot water for 2 hours each morning and evening. Lieutenant Yamada recorded her observations in a diary that would later be preserved in the archives of the National Diet Library in Tokyo. The entries from those early months reveal a mind in transition, struggling to reconcile experience with expectation. February 3rd. The food today included rice, pickled vegetables, and fish. The rice was of poor quality compared to what we received during the war, before the shortages, but it was rice, and there was enough. I do not understand this. We are prisoners. We are defeated enemies. Why do they feed us adequately? Sato-san suggests it is to keep us healthy for interrogation or trial. This makes sense, but the quantity seems excessive for this purpose. February 9th. An American nurse came today to conduct medical examinations. She was accompanied by a Japanese-American translator, a woman named Keiko who speaks Tokyo dialect with a strange accent. The nurse was professional, clinical. She examined us the way a doctor examines patients, not the way I had been taught captors examine prisoners. When I flinched during the examination, I could not help it. She stopped and explained through the translator what she was doing and why. She asked permission before continuing. I did not know how to respond. Permission? I am a prisoner. What does my permission matter? February 14th. Today was strange. One of the younger prisoners, Corporal Ito, began crying during evening rice distribution. She is only 21 and served as a typist in the Army Logistics Office. She cried not from sadness but from confusion. Why are they kind to us? She asked. When will they stop pretending? Captain Sato tried to comfort her but had no answer. None of us have answers. The American guards assigned to the women's facility were under strict orders, reinforced by Major Helen Patterson, the Women's Army Corps officer who supervised the female prisoner operations at Sugamo. Major Patterson was 43 years old, a former high school principal from Ohio who had joined the WAC in 1943. She ran the women's facility with the same no-nonsense efficiency she had once applied to managing teenage students, with one crucial addition. She understood, perhaps better than most of her male colleagues, that the Japanese women in her charge had been subjected to years of propaganda that taught them to expect the worst. Her approach was simple: demonstrate through consistent action that the propaganda was false. The problem, she wrote in a report to her commanding officer in March 1946, is not that these women distrust us. The problem is that they have been taught that distrust itself is insufficient protection. They have been taught that we are fundamentally incapable of decency, that any appearance of humanitarian treatment is merely a delay of inevitable brutality. Words cannot counter this belief. Only time and consistency can demonstrate its falsehood. Major Patterson implemented several policies designed to build what she called trust through transparency. Female prisoners were informed in advance of any policy changes. They were told the reasons for rules and regulations. When punishment was necessary for rule violations, the punishment was explained, documented, and consistent. When prisoners were summoned for interrogation, they were told beforehand what topics would be discussed. Perhaps most importantly, Major Patterson insisted that her guards treat the prisoners with formal courtesy, not friendliness, which might be misinterpreted as manipulation, but scrupulous, professional respect. The guards found this difficult at first. Many were young men who had fought in the Pacific, who had lost friends to Japanese bullets and bombs, who carried anger that was entirely justified. The idea of treating Japanese officers, even female ones, with courtesy felt like betrayal of the dead. But military discipline is a powerful force, and the orders were clear. Gradually, grudgingly, the system worked. Private James Morrison, a 24-year-old MP from Georgia, kept letters to his family that survived in a collection donated to the National World War II Museum. In April 1946, he wrote, "It's the damnedest thing, Ma. We guard these Japanese women, and they look at us like we're about to murder them at any second. We bring them their meals. We keep the facility clean. We follow all the regulations about proper treatment, and they still flinch when we walk past. Sergeant Taylor says it'll take time, that they've been lied to about us for years. I guess that makes sense, but it's strange to be feared for things you haven't done and don't intend to do. Makes you realize how much of war is just lies people tell about each other. The fear was not irrational. The Japanese women at Sugamo knew what had happened in Manchuria when the Soviet army arrived in August 1945. They had heard the reports, fragmentary, horrifying, of mass rapes, of women and girls assaulted by the thousands as the Red Army swept through Japanese settlements. They knew what Japanese soldiers themselves had done in Nanjing, in Manila, in villages across China and Southeast Asia. They had been taught that all armies behaved this way, that the Americans simply hid it better, that the veneer of civilization was thin and would crack under the pressure of victory. So they watched. They waited. They looked for the crack. The confusion deepened when the packages began arriving. In March 1946, the International Committee of the Red Cross established regular supply deliveries to Sugamo Prison. The packages contained standard items, soap, toothbrushes, writing paper, pencils. But they also contained luxuries that stunned the Japanese prisoners: chocolate, coffee, cigarettes, canned fruit. These items were distributed equally to all prisoners, regardless of rank or the severity of charges they faced. Lieutenant Yamada's diary entry for March 18th reads, "Today we received packages from the Red Cross. Inside were items I have not seen since before the war: chocolate, real coffee, American cigarettes." The guards distributed them without comment, as if this were normal, as if feeding your enemies luxuries made any sense at all. Tanaka-san suggested that perhaps these are bribes, meant to make us cooperative during interrogations. But I have been interrogated 3 times now, and each time the American officers asked their questions, recorded my answers, and sent me back to quarters. No torture, no threats, just questions. This is not how interrogation is supposed to work. This is not how enemies are supposed to behave. The chocolate became a symbol, passed between prisoners, examined, discussed in whispered conversations during the evening hours. It was Hershey's chocolate, standard issue in American K-rations, unremarkable to American soldiers but miraculous to Japanese prisoners who had not tasted sugar in adequate quantities for years. The Japanese military had restricted sugar consumption to essential medical uses by 1944. Civilian rations had been cut to starvation levels by 1945. Tokyo had burned. Cities had been reduced to ash. Children had died from malnutrition in the final year of the war, and now the enemy was giving them chocolate. Corporal Ito, the young typist who had cried in February, kept her piece of chocolate for 3 days before eating it. When she finally did, she cried again, but this time for different reasons. "It tastes like we lost more than the war," she told Lieutenant Yamada. "It tastes like everything we were told was a lie." This was the beginning of the ideological collapse that would haunt Japanese prisoners for years after their release. The realization came slowly, in pieces, through accumulated evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. The Americans had food in abundance. They shared it even with enemies. They followed their own rules even when it was inconvenient. They treated prisoners according to written standards that they actually seemed to believe in. None of this made sense within the framework of militarist ideology that had defined the Japanese understanding of warfare. The propaganda had prepared Japanese soldiers and officers for American military efficiency, for industrial power, even for ruthless bombing campaigns. But it had not prepared them for bureaucratic humanitarianism, for the mundane application of principles that Americans themselves often took for granted. The propaganda had taught that America was weak, decadent, divided, incapable of sacrifice. Yet Americans had crossed the Pacific, had fought with a ferocity equal to Japan's own, had demonstrated a capacity for industrial production that dwarfed Japan's entire economy. And then, this was the incomprehensible part, had stopped at victory and begun implementing procedures designed to protect the rights of the defeated. "We did not lose to a weaker enemy," Captain Sato observed in May 1946, during one of the evening conversations that Lieutenant Yamada recorded. "We lost to an enemy who was stronger in ways we did not have words to describe. They had better weapons, yes, but they also had better ideas. And we cannot defeat an idea by dying for the emperor. We tried. We failed. And now they feed us chocolate and tell us we have rights. What are we supposed to do with that?" What they did was begin, slowly and painfully, to question everything they had been taught. The protection that confused Japanese women officers most profoundly was not the food or the medical care or the adequate shelter. It was the protection from sexual violence that was enforced with a rigor that seemed to make no practical sense to prisoners who had been taught that such violence was inevitable in war. In April 1946, an incident occurred that would become part of the unofficial oral history passed between Japanese prisoners at Sugamo. A young American soldier, a private whose name was never recorded in official documents, made an inappropriate comment to one of the Japanese prisoners during a routine cell inspection. The comment was sexual in nature, though not an explicit threat. It was the kind of remark that might have been dismissed as harmless vulgarity in a different context. It was not dismissed. The Japanese prisoner reported the comment to Major Patterson through one of the bilingual staff members. The report was investigated within 24 hours. The soldier was identified, questioned, and removed from guard duty at the women's facility immediately. Within a week, he was court-martialed for conduct unbecoming a soldier and violation of regulations regarding treatment of prisoners. He was demoted, fined, and reassigned to non-prisoner contact duties. This incident was discussed obsessively among the Japanese women prisoners. Lieutenant Yamada's diary entry for April 29th records, "The American soldier who made the crude remark to Nakamura-san has been punished. This is confirmed. He has been removed and disciplined. For words. Not for actions, just for words. I do not understand why the Americans would punish their own soldier to protect the dignity of an enemy prisoner. What strategic purpose does this serve?" Tanaka-san says it is proof that they fear international judgment, that they are performing for the Red Cross observers. But there were no observers present during the incident. No one witnessed it except Nakamura-san and the soldier. She could have said nothing. She could have accepted it as the inevitable price of defeat. But she reported it, and they acted. I cannot reconcile this with what I was taught about the enemy. The incident was not unique. American military records from occupation Japan document dozens of similar cases in which American soldiers were disciplined for mistreatment of prisoners, including Japanese women. The punishments were real, recorded in service records, and enforced through military justice system. This was not public relations. This was not performance for international observers. This was the application of regulations that existed because the American military, imperfect, inconsistent, often failing to live up to its own ideals, nonetheless maintained those ideals as enforceable standards. The contrast with Japanese military culture was absolute. Japanese soldiers who committed atrocities against civilian populations in occupied territories faced virtually no disciplinary action. Rape was so common in some theaters that it was treated as an unofficial privilege of conquest. When discipline was imposed, it was typically for violations of military order or for bringing shame to the unit through publicity, not for the suffering inflicted on victims. The idea that a soldier might be punished specifically to protect the rights and dignity of an enemy prisoner was alien to Japanese military practice, but it was standard operating procedure for the American military, enshrined in regulations that treated adherence to the laws of war as a matter of military discipline and national honor. Major Patterson understood that protecting Japanese women prisoners from sexual violence was not just a matter of following regulations. It was a strategic imperative in a broader ideological conflict. Every day these women are treated with respect according to our regulations, she wrote in a June 1946 report, is a day when they must confront the possibility that everything they were taught about us was false. This is not kindness. This is not mercy. This is demonstrating through action that a democratic society, even in war, maintains principles that constrain behavior. They were taught that we are barbarians who hide behind pretty words. We prove them wrong every day by following rules that protect even those who fought to destroy us. This is the ideological battle we must win. By summer 1946, Lieutenant Yamada and her fellow officers were experiencing what psychologists would later term cognitive dissonance at a profound level. They had been captured, held for months, interrogated, processed, and treated throughout with a level of procedural correctness that violated every expectation their training had instilled. They had not been harmed. They had not been assaulted. They had been fed adequately, given medical care, allowed to write letters home through Red Cross channels, and protected from mistreatment with a consistency that was more disturbing than cruelty would have been. Cruelty they could have understood. Cruelty would have confirmed their worldview. Cruelty would have proven that the sacrifice of millions of Japanese lives had been necessary to resist an enemy who deserved resistance. But consistent bureaucratic humanitarianism, that they had no framework to process. The interrogations revealed the depth of American abundance in ways that no propaganda could have prepared the Japanese prisoners for. Lieutenant Yamada was interrogated 7 times. Between February and July 1946, the sessions were conducted by officers from the Allied Translator and Interpreter Service, and they focused primarily on the organizational structure of Japanese military communications networks. The interrogations were professional, almost tedious. Questions were asked, answers recorded, clarifications sought. No torture, no threats, no psychological pressure beyond the inherent stress of the situation. But it was the background details that revealed the truth about American industrial capacity. The interrogation rooms were heated in winter, cooled by fans in summer. The American officers took notes on typewriters that appeared to be brand new, with ribbons that produced crisp, dark text. The paper was high quality, used freely, discarded when mistakes were made. Coffee was available constantly, not carefully rationed, not treated as a luxury, but brewed in large percolators and consumed casually throughout the day. The American officers wore uniforms that were clean, well-fitted, replaced regularly. Their boots showed polish and care. Their equipment was maintained fastidiously. These details accumulated. Lieutenant Yamada recorded them obsessively in her diary, trying to understand what they meant. June 12th. During today's interrogation, the American officer apologized because his typewriter jammed. He called for an aide, who brought a replacement typewriter within 5 minutes. 5 minutes. They had a spare typewriter waiting, in reserve, for convenience. I thought of the communications office where I served in 1944, where we had 3 typewriters for a staff of 47. And when one broke, we sent it to Tokyo for repair and waited 3 months for its return. The Americans treat typewriters as disposable. They have so many that they keep spares nearby just in case. What kind of nation does this? What kind of industrial capacity does this represent? The interrogators sometimes shared their own rations during long sessions, not as a kindness, but simply because the sessions stretched through meal times and it would have been inefficient to pause. Lieutenant Yamada ate American canned rations, beef stew, crackers, coffee, chocolate bars, fruit cocktail in heavy syrup. Each meal was individually packaged, designed for convenience, produced in quantities that must have numbered in the millions. June 28th. The American captain conducting today's interrogation mentioned casually that the U.S. military produced over 100 million K-ration units last year. 100 million. Individual meals packaged and distributed to soldiers around the world. I asked him to repeat the number because I thought I had misheard. He confirmed it. 100 million. He said it like it was routine, like this was simply what an army did. Feed its soldiers with individually packaged meals that included coffee and chocolate and fruit as standard items. We were proud when our ration system could provide rice and pickles to frontline troops. They were providing every soldier with luxuries we had not seen since before the war. How do you fight a nation like this? How do you resist an economy that can treat abundance as routine? The question haunted all of them. Japanese military planning in 1941 had been based on the assumption that American industrial power was exaggerated, that American society was too soft and divided to sustain a long war, that a quick series of decisive victories would force a negotiated peace. These assumptions had been proven catastrophically wrong, but the full extent of the error was only becoming clear to prisoners who could now see American logistics and supply operations up close. Private. Morrison's letters home described the same phenomenon from the American perspective. The Japanese prisoners are always shocked by the most normal things. Last week, one of them saw us throwing away half-empty cans of food. We opened too many for lunch and couldn't store the leftovers in this heat, and she looked like we'd committed a crime. These people lived through starvation. Their cities were bombed flat. They ate bark and grass in the final months of the war. And we're over here throwing away food because we made too much. It makes you realize how much of our victory was just having more stuff than they could ever produce. We didn't just beat them. We drowned them in resources they couldn't match. By summer 1946, Lieutenant Yamada had begun to understand that Japan had not lost the war in any single battle. Japan had lost the war before it began, in the vast disparity between industrial economies that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. The Bushido Code, the willingness to die for the emperor, the sacrifice of millions, all of it had been pitted against an economic system that produced abundance as a side effect of normal operation. We were taught that material wealth made societies weak, she wrote in July. We were taught that our spiritual strength would overcome their decadence. But they were not weak. They were not decadent. They were wealthy beyond our comprehension, and they used that wealth to build weapons and produce supplies, and feed armies that we could never match. We died for the emperor. They simply built more factories, and they won. And now they feed us with their abundance and treat us with their rules, and prove every day that the ideology we served was built on lies. The transformation was not universal, nor was it complete. Many Japanese prisoners clung to their beliefs, interpreting American behavior as manipulation or weakness rather than genuine principle. Some refused to accept Red Cross packages, viewing them as attempts to corrupt their loyalty. Others maintained silence during interrogations, holding to the military code that forbade cooperation with the enemy. The psychological investment in the ideology they had served was too deep to abandon easily. But for others, like Lieutenant Yamada, the accumulated evidence became impossible to dismiss. In August 1946, Major Patterson organized a series of educational sessions for prisoners who were determined not to be war criminals and who would eventually be released. The sessions covered basics of democratic governance, labor rights, women's rights, and international law. Attendance was voluntary. Lieutenant Yamada attended every session. The instructor was a Japanese-American professor named David Takahashi, who had spent the war teaching Japanese language to American intelligence officers, and who now served as a civilian consultant to the occupation authorities. Professor Takahashi did not condemn the Japanese prisoners. He did not lecture them on their guilt or shame. He simply explained in clear Japanese the principles underlying American democratic governance and international humanitarian law. Democracy is not just voting, he told them. Democracy is the idea that governments exist to serve people, not the other way around. That individuals have rights that cannot be taken away by the state. That even in war, even in defeat, human beings retain their dignity and their humanity. These ideas seem strange to you because you have been taught that the state is everything and the individual is nothing. But these are not uniquely American ideas. These are human ideas. They exist in Japanese philosophy too, in different forms buried under decades of militarism. But they exist. The question you must ask yourselves is not whether you can accept American ideas. The question is whether you can reclaim Japanese ideas that your government suppressed. Lieutenant Yamada's diary entry that evening was longer than usual. Professor Takahashi said something today that I cannot stop thinking about. He said that the problem with militarism was not that it made us too strong, but that it made us too weak, that it took everything we had, our lives, our labor, our loyalty, and used it for purposes that benefited only the leaders, not the people. He said that the soldiers who died in the Pacific died not for Japan, but for an ideology that would have destroyed Japan even if we had won the war. I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to defend the sacrifices of those who died. But I could not, because everything I have seen since capture suggests that he is right. We were not strong. We were not superior. We were controlled, manipulated, and sent to die for leaders who cared nothing for our lives or our futures. The Americans defeated us with abundance, yes, but they also defeated us with ideas. Ideas that value individual dignity, that limit government power, that treat even enemies as human beings with rights. These are not weak ideas. These are the strongest ideas I have ever encountered, and I do not know what to do with that knowledge. By September 1946, preparations began for the release of prisoners who were determined not to be involved in war crimes. Lieutenant Yamada and most of her fellow women officers fell into this category. They had served in administrative capacities, had committed no atrocities, and posed no threat to occupation authorities. The process was bureaucratic, methodical, designed to reintegrate prisoners back into Japanese society with minimal disruption. On the day before her release, Lieutenant Yamada was called to Major Patterson's office. The meeting was brief. Major Patterson explained the release procedures, provided documentation, and asked if there were any questions. Lieutenant Yamada had prepared a statement in English, which she delivered haltingly. "I want to thank you for your treatment. I do not deserve it. I served the army that attacked you. I believed things about you that were not true. You protected me when I expected harm. You fed me when I expected starvation. You treated me with dignity when I expected cruelty. I do not know how to repay this." Major Patterson's response was noted in her official diary, copies of which are preserved in the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center. "I told her that repayment was not necessary, that we followed our regulations because we believe in them, not because we expect gratitude. But if she wanted to do something meaningful, she could tell the truth about her experience. She could tell other Japanese people that Americans follow rules even in war, that democracy is not weakness, and that the propaganda they were taught was false. I told her that the peace we are trying to build requires truth, and she has the ability to speak it. That is worth more than gratitude." Lieutenant Yamada was released on September 24, 1946. She returned to Tokyo, to a city still in ruins, to a society struggling to understand its own defeat. She found work as a translator, married a clerk from the Ministry of Finance, and lived quietly for the next 34 years. But she also wrote. Her memoir, published in 1967, under the title August Shadows, became one of the first Japanese accounts to describe honestly the treatment of prisoners by American forces and to question the ideology that had driven Japan to war. One passage from that memoir became widely quoted in Japanese schools. "We were taught that the Americans were devils. We were taught that capture meant horror. We were taught that death was preferable to surrender. And then they gave us chocolate. They followed their rules. They protected us with a consistency that destroyed our certainty. This was not weakness. This was strength of a kind we had no words for. They defeated us not just with bombs, but with the stubborn insistence that even in war, even in victory, human beings have rights that cannot be violated. This is what we lost to. This is what we must learn from." The confusion of Japanese women officers in American custody was not an isolated phenomenon. It was repeated in various forms across thousands of prisoners in the aftermath of the Pacific War. Male prisoners experienced similar cognitive dissonance, though often filtered through different cultural expectations and military roles. Civilian prisoners, detained for various reasons during the chaotic occupation period, encountered the same systematic adherence to regulations that seemed inexplicable from within the framework of militarist ideology. The pattern was consistent: expectation of brutality, followed by procedural correctness, followed by confusion, followed slowly, sometimes over years, by ideological re-evaluation. This was not an accident. This was the intended outcome of policies that had been debated and refined over decades of American military development. The Geneva Conventions did not exist because military leaders believed war could be made gentle. They existed because military leaders believed that maintaining certain standards, even in the brutality of war, was essential to preserving the humanity of soldiers and the legitimacy of governments. Violations occurred, frequently, tragically, sometimes with impunity. The American military was not perfect. American soldiers committed atrocities. American policies sometimes failed. The treatment of Japanese Americans in internment camps within the United States represented a catastrophic failure of the very principles that the military was supposed to uphold abroad. But the ideal existed. The regulations existed. The enforcement mechanisms existed. And when they worked, when soldiers followed orders to treat prisoners humanely, when officers enforced regulations even when it was inconvenient, when the system functioned as designed, the results were powerful, precisely because they were so unexpected, to those who had been taught that such principles were lies. The symbolic power of American abundance played a crucial role in this transformation. The chocolate, the coffee, the clean uniforms, the spare typewriters, these were not just material goods. They were evidence of an economic system that produced surplus, that could afford to waste resources, that treated luxury as routine. For prisoners who had lived through years of rationing and deprivation, this abundance was overwhelming. It suggested that the sacrifices they had made, the privations they had endured, had been imposed not by necessity, but by choice, by a government that had mobilized total war while telling its people that there was no alternative, that hardship was virtue, that suffering was strength. The Americans proved otherwise. They proved that abundance was possible. They proved that feeding prisoners adequately, protecting their dignity, following humanitarian regulations, all of this was possible without undermining military effectiveness. Indeed, the ease with which Americans maintained these standards suggested that they barely noticed the cost. A nation that could produce 100 million ration packets, that could keep spare typewriters in reserve, that could afford to throw away excess food. Such a nation could afford the luxury of humanitarian principles. This was the deepest wound to Japanese militarist ideology. Not just that Japan had lost, but that it had lost to a nation that did not need to sacrifice its principles to win. America had fought with overwhelming force and had followed its own rules. It had bombed cities and maintained prison camp standards. It had killed hundreds of thousands with atomic weapons and then fed the survivors with systematic humanitarian operations. The contradiction was apparent, troubling, unresolved. But the message was clear. American victory was not the victory of a desperate nation, marshaling all resources for survival. It was the victory of a nation so wealthy, so powerful, that it could afford to care about the treatment of enemy prisoners while simultaneously destroying enemy cities. For those who served the empire and survived to become prisoners, this realization was devastating. It meant that everything they had suffered had been unnecessary. It meant that the leaders who had sent millions to die had been not just wrong, but catastrophically deluded about the nature of the enemy and the balance of power. It meant that the spiritual superiority they had been taught to believe in was no match for industrial capacity and political systems that, whatever their flaws, produced both weapons and humanitarian regulations in abundance. The epilogue of Lieutenant Yamada Fumiko's story is quieter than its beginning. She lived to the age of 91, dying in 2005 in a Tokyo suburb, surrounded by children and grandchildren who grew up in a democratic Japan that she had once been taught to believe was impossible. In her later years, she occasionally spoke to students and historians about her experiences. The message she conveyed was consistent. I was confused because everything I believed was false. The Americans protected me not because they were kind, though some were kind, but because they believed in rules. They believed that even enemies have rights. They believed this so strongly that they punished their own soldiers for violations. I could not understand this because I had been taught that such beliefs were masks, performances, lies told to hide savagery. But they were not lies. They were principles, enforced through law, maintained even when it was difficult. This is what democracy means. Not just voting, but the belief that power must be limited, that individuals have dignity that cannot be stripped away, that rules apply even to the powerful. I was confused because I had never encountered this before. My confusion taught me that the war we fought was not just a military defeat. It was a defeat of ideas, and the ideas that defeated us were stronger because they were true. The confusion of Japanese women officers in American custody was not a failure of understanding. It was understanding beginning to break through decades of indoctrination. It was the painful recognition that propaganda and reality had diverged so completely that the gap could only be crossed through the accumulated evidence of lived experience. Every meal provided, every medical examination conducted professionally, every rule followed, every prisoner protected. These were small acts that added up to a revelation that was more dangerous to the defeated ideology than any weapon. The greatest victory of democracy is not that it destroys its enemies. The greatest victory is that it proves, through patient consistency, that the fears enemies have been taught are false, that the alternatives they have been told are impossible are real, and that human dignity is not a luxury reserved for times of peace, but a principle that can be maintained even in war, even in defeat, even when dealing with those who recently fought to destroy you. Lieutenant Yamada was confused because she encountered grace in a context where she expected cruelty. Not grace as kindness, but grace as the systematic application of principles that elevate humanity above expediency. Her confusion was the beginning of understanding. Her understanding became wisdom that she spent the rest of her life sharing. And that wisdom, multiplied across thousands of prisoners and millions of citizens in occupied Japan, became part of the foundation for a transformed society that would eventually become one of America's closest allies. The chocolate bar was just chocolate. The clean uniforms were just uniforms. The medical examinations were just medical examinations. But together, sustained over months, applied systematically to enemies who expected horror, these mundane acts became a weapon more powerful than any bomb. The demonstration that another way of organizing society was not just possible but superior, not just in theory but in practice, not just in times of plenty but even in the aftermath of the most destructive war in human history. This is what confused them. This is what changed them. This is what echoes still in memoirs and archives and histories, as testimony to the power of principles maintained even when the cost seems too high, the enemy too bitter, and the victory too complete to require restraint. The confusion was real. The transformation was real. And both remain as evidence that the most powerful weapons are sometimes the most unexpected. Simple human decency, applied systematically, even to those who believed such decency was impossible.